is cool to have a theme song. And I'll tell you, the lyrics of that song are actually really intentional. You didn't get to hear a lot of it, but what it says is, if you close your eyes, this looks like it might be something that will never change at all. And it goes on to talk about how you decide to be optimistic in the face of that situation. And I think my very small hack team in a dusty basement of the Department of Education might adopt that as our theme song. What we're up to is deciding to stop being people who are reforming education from the fringes and from the outside, and coming into the belly of a big bureaucracy to think about reinventing the entire way that we do school in Colorado. So I want to share with you that story today, and that song is relevant because when you decide to take that on, you need a little bit of optimism and you need a little bit of strategy. So whenever I talk about education, I have to start right here. These are two former students of mine, and Juan Diego and Ileana. Ileana will be home in 2 weeks, having just finished her first semester at Duke on a full-ride scholarship. And thank you. And Juan Diego is at the University of Denver, where he has a Millennium Scholarship, which means that his entire education through his PhD has already been paid for. Now, if these kids were from a different neighborhood, or they were of a different race, this actually would not be an interesting story. But what's true of these two kids is that their birthright in Denver, not too far from the La Alma neighborhood, is being born into a statistic in Denver that if you are from a low-income family, so $24,000 a year for a family of 4, your chance of getting a college degree is 1 in 11. And I've spent about the last 15 to 20 years of my career on a burning platform about the fact that whether you care about that from an economic perspective or from a moral perspective, it's something we have to change. One of the reasons I had that burning platform is that I was the CEO of a small system of charter schools that, through heroic teaching efforts, was able to prove every day that we can actually close that achievement gap, and we can do it right now, every day, in every classroom in this city. And we had a group of kids who, despite being about 97% below the poverty line, outpaced the city and the state in every standardized test we threw in front of them, and in every college admissions rate that we could find. Now, some things were also true, which is that no one in the country has figured out how to help these kids persist all the way through college. That even when they have the same economic resources and full rides and the same academic readiness, something's not happening once they hit the floor and the walls of a college campus. And when I started to think about that, I'd been at this work for a long time, and these two kids and their classmates became juniors in high school. And we had opened a high school from scratch. And all of a sudden, these kids were looking at us and looking at the promise we'd made. And this is the same promise that many of us went through our K-12 experience believing, that if you worked hard and you did well and you got to college, a professional job was waiting at your door. And the same year that these kids became juniors in high school, the economy shifted, and that was no longer a promise I could actually make to them. And that was true just because of economic realities, but I also started to worry it was true because of something that's inherent in our education system. This is a classroom. Some of you have seen slides like this. This is a classroom from the 19th century. And there are pieces of our education system that, through nobody's fault today, are just designed for a completely different time. And I remember being in Leadership Denver and having my cohort and my friends who worked in industries that, of course, their workplaces looked dramatically different than the 19th century. And yet, even on our best days, when we were part of a group of about, I'd say 20 or 25 schools in Denver that are dramatically changing what we know kids can do and proving what's possible and showing that in the 21st century in a place like Denver, your demographics absolutely do not dictate your democracy or your future, our workplace still looks pretty much the same. You've got a teacher at the front of the class, you've got kids in rows and desks, they're studying for some rote information, and those tests are important. This is not a story of realizing that our movement toward education 2.0, which is standards and accountability and high expectations, this is not a story of feeling like that's not important. But it is a story of saying, I worried all of a sudden, not about how I was going to raise the money to keep running a $10 million nonprofit and open our 5th school, but instead I worried that we were actually setting our kids up for failure. Because while education hadn't changed at all, the economy they would go into work in was dramatically different. And so it was through some friends, actually 2 friends from my Leadership Denver class, that I sat with and said, there's probably nothing more important than closing the achievement gap in Denver and in the country. But that work needs an evangelist. And all of a sudden, I've got more questions than answers about how to do that. And so a few months ago, I transitioned to the Colorado Department of Education where, like I said, small hack team inside of bureaucracy, trying to figure out, what if we got ahead of the curve finally? And instead of being reactive in the world of education, we got a little bit more forward thinking about what kids actually need to know when they exit our system. We talked to economists to understand, how has the world changed? We talked to employers to say, what are you seeing in your current graduates and what are they not able to do that really matters? The truth was that we were training kids to do really well in skills that are very easily outsourced, given to robots and automatized. We weren't training them well because our schools just weren't designed to train them well to do collaboration, to train them well to solve complex problems. We weren't, if you look at this picture, even training them well to understand how you use technology in a strategic way. We asked kids to take their device, turn it off, and spend 8 hours pretending that the teacher was still the only source of an answer. And so we started, what we're doing now at the department is saying, what if we actually are, in all of our well-intended work to raise standards and get more kids to a bar, actually chasing a little bit of the wrong goal? And that the paradigm, this game that high-performing schools in low-income neighborhoods have started getting good at winning, might be a little bit the wrong game. So these things obviously don't come as surprises to you who work outside of education. You all work, for the most part, in industries that have been changed by the modern economy. But this is really a different way to think about education, to say that we know that students need dramatically different skills than our schools are structured for them to develop. That our school structure, despite some heroic work of a few people in a few schools, is really about an industry and factory model that trained factory workers really well for what they would do for the next 50 years. We also know that this last bullet is critically important, that one of the original designs in the Enlightenment thinking of public education was to prepare kids to be engaged in their community. And it's interesting, you think back to that lyric that maybe nothing's changed at all. For those of you that have been on the fringes of education for 20 plus years, this is not a new conversation, but it is a new way of thinking about the system redesign. That really we need to get back to a place potentially where schools are about helping people and kids understand their power to engage in a community. We do really well for kids who are good at the game of school. They leave school knowing how to be powerful change agents in their community. But for kids for whom there are some stumbling blocks, we don't often have other experiences that let them realize that. The other thing that we've been up to for the last 9 months, which is really fascinating, is that because of some philanthropy, we are able to participate with 12 other jurisdictions from around the world who are looking at the same thing, saying, what if you cracked open the whole system? What if instead of building great schools on the fringes and trying to prove what's possible, you actually went into the center and thought about what we believe about kids and what they need to know? And there are 2 other jurisdictions in there, there's Kentucky and New York. But there's also China and South Korea and Finland and Brazil. And all of us are giving each other some critical feedback in a process that's been led by a great professor whose book I totally recommend, Dr. Young Zhao out of the University of Oregon. And I'll tell you a little story about China because it's easier than to hold the mirror up to ourselves. So he's spent half of his life in China and half of his life in the US, and in both cases trying to understand how to reform education systems. And he worked with us and he brought the Chinese team that he had this conversation with, and he said, they came to me and said, what we want is to rebuild our school system so that the next Bill Gates comes out of China. We have creative, entrepreneurial thinkers. And he said, in a way that he could say, because he'd spent about 40 years working in that community and was from there, no shot. Everything in the DNA of your community is designed so that that will never be your competitive advantage. So what if we hold the mirror up, not just to the US, but even specifically to Colorado, and say, what is it about our community that collaborates so easily, where your courage and your great idea seems to matter a little more than your pedigree? What are the things about Colorado that are so deeply in our DNA and in the water that if we designed a school system around them, we'd actually hand kids their competitive advantage? I can guarantee you that's not necessarily how the current system has been designed. But there's a piece of that in this model, and this is what the department has put out, is the idea that let's put a kid at the middle. So let's not talk about how you reinvent the system. We've been up to that for a lot of years without a lot of measurable impact. But put a kid at the system and ask, What does that student, when they're 18, 19, 17, and they exit the K-12 system, what do they need to be good at in order to engage in a global economy? And how are those things radically different than the economy 60, 80, 100 years ago that system was developed to prepare them for? And we have 3 buckets. I'll go quickly through this because it gets dangerously close to kind of education wonk. But the first is academic competencies. Absolutely, your basic skills in math and reading, and the third bullet, your ability to reason and analyze that data, still critically important. That kind of technical business of schools doesn't go away, and it's at the top of this model. You'll notice Rick said architects like Venn diagrams, former teachers like them even more. But the other two are things that school used to be about in some places for some kids, but not in all places for all kids. And this is about, I think, giving a language to some things we might be able to do differently. The second there is your professional competencies, and this is what we hear from employers all the time. That, yeah, I've got kids who can master their basic skills. I've got kids with great degrees from impressive colleges, but if you ask them to manage time and manage a project, they wait for the next direct instruction. Or they really don't understand how to collaborate with people who are dramatically different than them. And the third is entrepreneurial competencies, not saying that every kid needs to be prepared to start their own business. But this is some language to what we think is different about the 21st century that kids will go on to work in. That they need to understand how to learn from failure in a dramatically different way than that system was created to help them experience failure. They need to be able to make connections where other people can't see them and to smartly manage risk in a system that really has been designed to prevent them from doing any of those things. You can go a little deeper and start to look at the workforce inside education and say that maybe we've actually drawn people who are pretty compliant thinkers, and if we haven't, we sure have slapped them on the wrist enough to make sure they become compliant thinkers. And how do we start to unwind that human capital model in a way that really cracks everything open for kids? Now, it's really easy to stand on the sidelines and say, like, here's some more things that schools should be up to that they're not up to. That happens a lot, so we go one step deeper. We talk about 2 other things, though. One is self-knowledge. The idea that if you remember your first job in your 20s, you quickly discovered where you were better at this and where you weren't so good. And you realized, oh man, I have a lot of creative ideas. I'm great on the entrepreneurial competencies, but if I ever want to get a project out the door, I sure better get a buddy who's going to help with that part. You can also think about your current team at work and map them against this, right? Like the person who has great professional competencies and just doesn't know their stuff, doesn't have the academic stuff, like nicest person on your team, really hard to fire, but isn't going to get there. And so we think that the self-knowledge, where we could actually give language to this model to kids and have them map where their growth areas, where their natural strengths are, could really be helpful for a lot of kids, not just the kids who are academically strong and have always said, well, I do school well, but for kids whose greatest capacities have been a little bit unrecognized by the current system. And then we think school still needs to be about what it was supposed to be about out of the Enlightenment era. That really we still need to inspire kids to do something with all of those competencies and all of that potential. But the fact that many of us in affluent communities have a kid with a great bachelor's degree living in our basement is an economic problem and a social imperative and a sign of failure, not just in our lowest performing schools in low-income areas, but perhaps of the entire way we've asked kids to think about their own education. So this is where I mentioned we do go one step further. And we talk about what are learning environments, and we particularly don't say classrooms, because 10 years from now, these may not look like classrooms, and we actually hope that they won't. But what do those learning environments need to look like to start to achieve real development of all of these competencies for kids, so that when they become employers or hopefully employees or hopefully employers, they are far better prepared to engage in a rapidly changing, far more volatile and complex economy. The first is it's personal and personalized. That kids need to be deeply known and known well. That teachers need to be empowered with the data to know the differences between every kid and meet them where they are. And that parents and kids could be engaged by a system where they have a voice in choosing a path toward what they think they might want to achieve. The second is competency-based. This is the idea that we could stand back and question the fact that when you're 5, you start kindergarten no matter what, not when you're 4, probably not when you're 6. And then you move in batches, no matter what you've achieved or what you know or how ready you are for the next thing, that a competency or a mastery-based system could crack that open. The third is co-created, and I think our theme today is becoming what happens when you really listen. We've shopped this model in the last 9 months with every group of educators who will have us. And this used to say student-driven, because what we were trying to get at was like kids having a voice in their own learning. And we had a session with about 50 really excellent teachers, and they said, when I say student-driven, there are a few leftover teachers in my school who think what that means is, well, I taught it, and the kid wasn't driven enough to get it. We said, okay, that's not what we mean at all. So let's talk a little bit more about how you engage kids in co-creating their own learning experiences. The fourth is safe and healthy. Believe it or not, this is an incredibly political thing for us to come out and say, that we actually think for kids to be able to achieve, to meet a higher bar, to take risks, that their classrooms need to be socially and emotionally safe, and that they need to be physically and mentally healthy. And that is, whether we like it or not, the business of our community and the business of schools. And the fifth is time, talent, and technology enabled. When I tell people that I'm now working on innovation for the Department of Education, they think I do tech. Couldn't be further from the truth, and that's good for kids, because that's not my world. But what this is about is not saying, oh, let's innovate. Our schools need to look more innovative. Let's put a laptop in the hands of every kid. Or I know it's a one-to-one device for every school. But instead, this is about a strategy for what you want kids to achieve, and then having your use of technology follow. Similarly, your use of time. That for years and years and years in education, typically it's a 48-minute class period. If you're a really innovative school, you might have a 90-minute class period. But nobody's really questioned how you're thinking about the day, or why weekends are sacred, or a conversation we've had more in our community about why summers in a non-agrarian society are still sacred time. And then finally, talent. That instead we could begin to think about who engages with our kids as teachers. You can think about this particularly from a career and tech ed model or a STEM model, that could be wildly different, and how we train teachers to engage kids could also be wildly different. This ultimately is our biggest goal, that instead of building the school system we have now and then trying to tinker on the edges, that we could be leading in a conversation in Colorado that says, what if we design schools in such a way that every kid actually left them more curious than they came in? So that's our goal. This is absolutely a work in process, and there are a lot of questions. How do we leverage workforce? And how do we design a system that actually has room for student and parent voice? What does accountability need to look like? We know that there's been great strides and great rationale for our accountability system, but like any accountability system, it's had some unintended consequences, and how do we evolve that? And then the most interesting one, I think, is how do we drive innovation and experimentation in a sector, in an industry that is known for neither of those things. So that's what we're up to. I have learned a lot of things through my Leadership Denver time and my alum time. And the first is that if you ask for engagement in a room like this, you actually get it. So since we're among friends, my ask, and I know Jandel asked you to put your phones away, is that if sometime today you're interested in one of the following conversations that I'll explain, you just send me an email. We are going to begin, through our partners at the Legacy Foundation, a year's worth of consumer engagement conversations in Colorado, where we engage two groups of people. Now we're doing student engagement too, but for you all, if you're interested in this conversation either as an employer of all the kids that will exit the system in this state, or as a parent, or as both, we would love to have you start to join the roundtables that we'll be having in 2014 to help us think about how we start to take this theoretical model and our 5 early adopter school districts and start to go down a path of radically thinking differently about how kids learn and demonstrate what they know.